Hamatake ape, ampetukinle shantewashte, Senator Mary Kunishimaki ape, Malakota. I am Senator Mary Kunish from the state of Minnesota. I welcomed you in a greeting from the Lakota people that says I'm happy to be here, and I welcome you with a warm heart and a warm handshake. I will be a participant in this slideshow. I am myself a descendant of the Standing Rock Lakota Nation. I've been in the Minnesota Senate for the last 2 years and the Minnesota House for 4 years before that. While I was in the House, I passed legislation to create the first comprehensive missing and murdered Indigenous women's task force. And then following up on that, the first in the nation missing and murdered Indigenous relatives permanent office in our state government. So I'm happy to be here and share the good work that we have done. And now I will turn it over to Juliette Rudy to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Juliette Rudy. I'm the director of the new Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, which was created this year. I've been in that position since February of 2022. I come with a law enforcement background. I was with the St. Paul Police Department for 21 years and then with the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office for 7 years. I'm really excited about getting work done and helping with the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives epidemic. So we'll talk about that in our presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie.
Loma, Petu Washte. Good afternoon, everybody. My driver's license name is Stephanie Autumn. My Hopi name is Kimiosi. My Lakota name is Tachateo Yateo Nagewi. She holds the people in her heart woman. My father is Joseph Kimiosi from Old Arribi. I'm the mother of 6, grandmother of 16, and I am the founder of the American Indian Prison Project. I currently work at Tribal Law and Policy Institute as the director of the Tribal Youth Resource Center, and I was honored to be a consultant for the Minnesota State Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force.
Anine, bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Martin Rogers. I'm a White Earth Nation descendant, and I'm a research scientist at Wilder Research. And I was the lead researcher on the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Task Force project. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about first. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. So I'm going to talk about what is the MMIW Injustice in Minnesota. Senator Kunesh will talk a little bit more about the task force and mandates. Juliette will talk about how we're going to try to increase some safety and procedural justice for MMIW cases. And Stephanie will talk about supporting Indigenous survivors, perpetrators, and communities. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for some of your questions and discussion. So we know that Indigenous people are far more likely to experience violence and go missing or be murdered than people of other races in Minnesota. In fact, American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of the state's population, but they account for about 8% of all murder victims. And in any given month, there might be 27 to 54, around that number, of actively missing Indigenous women and girls in the state. So in Minnesota, we have 11 American Indian tribes, including 7 Ojibwe tribes in the northern part of the state and 4 Dakota communities in the southern part of the state. We also have large urban Indian populations in the Twin Cities, Duluth, Bemidji, Fargo-Moorhead, and other areas that are not on reservation or in Indian country, as we say. Minnesota is one of several states that are included in the Federal Public Law 280, which gave states some jurisdiction over crimes that happen in Indian country. And 2 of Minnesota's reservations, including Red Lake and Boys Fort, are exempted from this law, so the tribe shares jurisdiction with the federal government only in those places. So Public Law 280 and other federal and state laws have created this complex system in which jurisdiction can vary depending on the location of the crime, the tribal enrollment status of the victim, and the perpetrator of the crime. And so this is a complex system that we're working in, and sometimes also jurisdiction might be used as a little bit of an excuse for some of the poor or faulty investigation practices that we'll talk about a little bit later. So this problem is obviously pretty overwhelming, and we know that there are multiple causes as well as multiple points in the system where changes or interventions could make a difference to reduce the MMIW injustice in Minnesota. The root causes of the MMIW injustice are based in colonization and historical trauma, racism and sexism, and the sexual objectification of Indigenous women and girls. These root causes may be among the most difficult to address because they're so entrenched in our society and in this country's history. However, it's important to keep in mind that the problems that came about over the last 500 years is what we're talking about here. There's major social issues that underlie the high rates of victimization among Indigenous people that we see today. There are also major systemic risk factors for experienced violence and abuse among Indigenous people, including poverty, lack of housing, involvement in the child welfare system and the criminal justice system, being a victim of domestic violence, being involved in prostitution and trafficking. So it's really important to understand how systems have created disparate risk for Indigenous peoples. We can't blame increased risk of experiencing violence and exploitation on individual bad behavior and poor choices alone. So, and I would also add that substance use and addiction, as well as normalized violence, are all part of systemic factors that put Indigenous people at higher risk of experiencing these kinds of violence. So we know that Indigenous people are more likely to experience violence. And we've also found through the research that we did with the task force and lots of other research before this and lots of experiences that we heard about, that once an Indigenous person is reported as missing or is found deceased in suspicious circumstances, that they're less likely to receive justice due to problems with the investigation, prosecution, and sentencing processes. So through our research, we learned about several key issues, including, again, cooperation across jurisdictions, immediate notification of the missing persons alert system and the media process for communicating with the public about missing persons, the careful and thorough death investigation that could be conducted by a trained forensic experts versus a coroner, which is a medical doctor from any field that doesn't have any particular training in forensics. So these are some of the key places where investigations often fall short in Indian country. And Juliet is going to talk more in a minute about how we can improve investigations and begin to address this aspect of the MMIW injustice. So our research also found that the system does not have adequate resources and that the criminal justice system often doesn't use an approach that supports prevention and healing. So later in the presentation, Stephanie will tell us about her work to address healing, both from within the prison system and within communities using restorative circles. First, I just want to show you a bit more about the nature of the MMIW injustice. So this chart shows a key fact that probably won't surprise many of you, that American Indian children are very much overrepresented among children who are placed out of their home by the child protection system. So this pattern of taking children from their families and communities can be traced back to the history of boarding schools and even earlier. So it's a pattern that has been really established across many, many generations for Indigenous peoples. And it has caused trauma to families. In some cases has led to breakdown of effective family systems, definitely loss of traditional parenting practices and traditional family roles. So it's created also tremendous mistrust of the child protection system among American Indian families. But what these data don't show us is the link to the MMIW injustice. So the Minnesota Department of Human Services reported that 601 American Indian children ran away from their out-of-home placement between 2015 and 2019. 601. And many of these children might be being exploited or being trafficked. And that, of course, puts them on a direct path to either becoming incarcerated or becoming MMIW statistics. And so that's a connection with the system that we can't ignore. We also wanted to dig in a bit to how some of these findings related to human trafficking and the MMIW injustice. So the most recent year that we had data for the report that we did for the task force, we found that 1 out of 5 reported sex trafficking incidents involve American Indian victims. And you might remember from earlier that I showed you that American Indians make up about 1% of the state's population. So we're extremely overrepresented among this group of trafficking victims. Many of the experts who we interviewed talked about the market for Indigenous women and girls, and you know, how they've been portrayed as exotic or hypersexualized, needing to be conquered. This has been done in the range of media, from the history we learned in middle school to Disney, to you know, Disney movies, to news stories, to hardcore porn. Across the board, these kind of themes and narratives come up. And so, you know, we see this today with internet prostitution, with specific markets, trafficking at sporting events. And I'll show you in a minute about the trafficking that happens at man camps around exploitive industries. So an important aspect of the MMIW injustice is the extent to which the perpetrators of these crimes are not held accountable. You can see from this visual that only a very small proportion of all the people who are arrested for sex trafficking end up actually getting convicted. And in general, we know that sex trafficking cases are difficult to prosecute. And many of the experts that we talked about the challenges of getting sex trafficking survivors to participate in this process, which is due to a range of factors, but in other cases, the system also lacks resources to adequately investigate or prosecute cases. And there may be systemic bias against Indigenous women and girls, especially those that are involved in prostitution. So the end result is that sex trafficking crimes aren't being prosecuted a lot of times, and that individual victims and their entire families and communities start to believe that they won't get justice, even if they do come forward. And so this might result over time in even more Indigenous victims not seeking help when they're being victimized. And before I turn it over to Senator Kunesh, I just wanted to mention one last thing, is that you may have seen some of the recent media coverage of the Line 3 pipeline that was placed in northern Minnesota. And I mean, certainly there's been media coverage about all the environmental ramifications of that process. But in addition, there's a connection between these extractive industries and the man camps that go along with them. And, you know, these influx of workers can cause a range of problems for communities that might range from housing shortages to depletion of healthcare services or other resources in these small communities, when, you know, they have hundreds or thousands of workers moving in practically overnight to work on these pipeline projects. But then there's also the issue that having lots of men, some of whom may have histories of sexual violence, you know, a lot of these companies don't necessarily screen for or limit people who have been convicted of sex crimes from working at their places. So these guys are in these camps, they have difficult working conditions, they're working hard, and then they get a paycheck and they don't have anywhere to go. They're in this small town. And that creates a situation where a lot of women and girls are exploited, and it's local women and girls. So a lot of times when these projects are going through Indian country, it's Indigenous women and girls. And some of the advocates we talked to in our project referred to this as the double rape of the environment and the women and girls who live in these communities. And I just wanted to show you this image. On the left is some of the Indigenous water protectors who are leading the efforts. And then on the right is a group called Your Call Minnesota, which was set up by Enbridge as a requirement of their Line 3 project permit. And so one of the mandates from the task force was to encourage these big companies that are leading these large pipeline projects and similar projects in Indian country to take a more active and really earnest role in keeping the communities safe by doing better background checks, not hiring predators, providing training and monitoring at their sites, holding staff and leadership accountable for their actions. I'm sure Senator Kunesh might want to talk more about that, but I'm actually going to turn it over to her now so she can talk more about the task force's work to date and next steps and some of the mandates that they had. So Senator, I'll turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Well, we in Minnesota, our task force was, the creation of it was created for the community and by the community. And we really worked with the people who were doing the work at the time to ensure that the outcome would have the best effect and would glean us the most information in order to continue the work. And so the requirement of the task force itself was, of course, to examine the systemic causes that perpetrate Indian country here in Minnesota, whether it's northern Minnesota on reservations, the urban core, where we have a large Native population in Minneapolis and St. Paul, or southern Minnesota. We also mandated the expectation that we would examine appropriate methods for tracking and collecting the data, because one of the biggest problems right from the start is people wanted to see the data. They wanted to know the numbers. Where is this happening? Why is this happening? You know, to who is this happening? But we didn't have data. And historically, across the nation, there wasn't that data collection. So we really didn't have much to work from. So we needed to make sure that we created in an appropriate tracking and collecting data collection base, so that it would also be shareable between different agencies, police departments, the BIA, whatever. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that we were going to report on, we wanted a report on the policies in the institutions, such as policing, child welfare, the coroner's practice, those governmental agencies that really do have impact on our Native communities, especially our Indigenous women and girls. And so we went on to require reports on any measures that are necessary that we could come up with from whatever we gleaned to address and reduce that violence against our women and girls. And then we wanted to make sure that the victims and the families and the communities also were provided the resources to prevent these things from happening, to heal from the violence. How can we make sure that those resources are available? This is a list of the task force members, and as you can see, we had 2 members from the House, 2 members from the Senate, 1 Republican, 1 Democrat. We had the BCA, the Sheriff's Association, U.S. Attorney's Office and County Attorney Association, the court system. The epidemiologist was extremely valuable in our discussions. And then we made sure that we had representation from all of our 11 federally recognized tribes here in Minnesota, along with some of the boots on the ground sort of people, such as Mending the Sacred Hoop, Lifehouse, Women's Foundation, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. And then we wanted to make sure that we had the voice of those that have been victims and victim families. So we had Chris Stark, who not only was a victim herself, but she is an author and researcher. So what we actually did, we held in-person and virtual task force meetings. Unfortunately, that was interrupted by COVID. We had high hopes of getting around the state and having opportunities for community members to come in and share their stories if they wanted, tell us about the things that are going on in their community that are working or not working, and just an ability to participate in this so that it didn't feel like a top-down sort of task force. We did literature reviews of the research, and that was really important, looking at what Canada had done and what they had found as well. And then we were able to, within that 18-month span, interview 32 different experts on this, I call it a pandemic. That really created a strong database for us and understanding of the complexities of this. We also went on to review state data. We dug deep into the state data around child welfare, deaths and human trafficking, missing persons, and crimes. Child welfare is a huge issue because of the high rates of foster care, of kids being removed, put into foster care, eventually perhaps being adopted out of their families, their communities, their tribes. And this makes them especially vulnerable to sex trafficking, and then of course self-medication through addictive sources. So we wanted to make sure we were doing that. And then we really were intentional about brainstorming and defining the mandates or the recommendations, the follow-up, what we needed to do to make sure that this just wasn't a report sitting on a shelf somewhere, but we were going to take action and really good action. Next slide. Let's see. Nicole, can you, oh, there we go. We also ended up creating a missing and murdered Indigenous women's office. We call it Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. It's permanent, interstate government and funded. But had to make sure that those fundings and those resources followed that office and followed the organizations and agencies that were going to do the work. We needed to look at how we are going to change systems through systemic, through that lens of systemic racism. And then what can we do to eliminate poverty and meeting just the basic needs? Because when somebody is homeless or they're hungry or they need something for their children, they oftentimes will compromise themselves in order to do that. And that makes them especially vulnerable. We are intentional about creating an annual missing and murdered report and a dashboard for people to follow and understand what we're doing and how it's been working, and then to look at the data that we've been able to accumulate, and then make sure that those state and federal technical assistance and supports are in place and available to the tribes so they have access in order to eventually be sharing that kind of information from the tribes and the state. And then we've got to, of course, enforce our tribes' sovereignty right and increase the jurisdictional authority to investigate and prosecute and sentence. Really glad that VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, was finally updated. We're still working on expanding the safe harbor laws here in Minnesota so that to all trafficking victims, not just 24 years and younger. We want to make sure that Juliet has the personnel and the state resources that she needs to do a really good job. And then of course, provide training and resources, especially in Indian country and the areas that are work in this area so that we're able to really do this in an efficient, appropriate way. One thing we realized during the task force is around deaths that receive an autopsy and are investigated by a coroner or a medical examiner. Oftentimes those that have deceased were just listed as a suicide, or they didn't know. When families would say, especially, no, there's no way that she committed suicide, there was this happening, that happening. So kind of like psychological autopsies rather than just relying on the coroner to make that decision. And then we want to make sure that we are continuing to really enforce and bolster our trauma-informed and victim-centered responses through the law enforcement and all of those. And then education is so important. We'd like to have that healthy relationships and consent in our schools, building awareness such as something like this. How can we reduce those harms of trafficking and sexual exploitation? requires sex trafficking awareness training all over the state, not just in Indian country. And then make sure that all of those decisions and the way that we go forward are through the lens of and informed by our Indigenous women and girls, and that all of the work that is done is supports culturally responsive and community-led efforts. And those are really, really, those last 2 points are so important. All right, I think, do I have this one or is it on to
This
Judy?
is Julie. Yep.
All right, I'm going to hand it right over to Juliet Rudy.
Hello, everyone. I'm the director of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, and the office was established and was signed into law by Governor Tim Walz in 2021. And this position, it was signed there in Minnesota State Statutes 299A.85, Office for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. And in the statute, it's very specific on what the duties of the director are. And so I'll just go over that a little bit. Community engagement. So when I began this position, I started with getting out and visiting with the tribal nations and urban Native community organizations. I meet with all 11 tribal councils, urban Native and community organizations to talk about the MMIR office. I give them updates on the work, let them know what's going on. Listen to concerns and suggestions that they might have. I always say, what do you think, or what are your expectations of the MMIR office? And also, I'm talking to them about requesting their assistance in the future with development of an MMIR protocol. I do a lot of community awareness presentations like this. In the tribal communities, I visit the Native urban community organizations. I go to colleges and universities, local, state, and federal agencies, faith-based groups I visit with, and community advocacy organizations. Right now, I'm an office of 1, but I'll be an office of 4, hopefully by January. We're hiring 3 additional staff. One will be a violence prevention coordinator that will help develop and implement culturally responsive MMIR prevention and awareness programming. And then also a community planner that'll help develop and implement a comprehensive long and short-term range goals, plans, projects, and programs. And then the MMIR intelligence specialist, which will help with assisting in investigating and establishing the authenticity of the data and collect and analyze the crime data, which is everything that I do in the MMIR office. I follow the report. The task force report set up an excellent framework for me to do my work. And in the report, it specifically talks about the data, and Senator Kunish went over that. I mean, the data is not streamlined. It's not real time, and it's all over the place. So the intelligence specialist will help with the data. Right now, I'm also working on facilitating a research project that will provide an assessment of systems of response and reporting of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives from tribal, local, state, and federal entities, and provide recommendations on the development of the MMIR protocol. It was very clear in the task force report that we needed to look at systems and how are we going to improve systems and where are the system gaps. Also, I'm developing an advisory council that will provide support and make recommendations on the work of the MMIR office. We're in the development stages on determining membership and discussing roles and responsibilities. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about investigation. When I go and I visit in the community. I educate in the Indigenous communities on what to do when someone goes missing. There's this common belief that there's a 24-hour rule. There's not a 24-hour rule. You need to report someone missing immediately. Calling law enforcement is the first step, and the sooner the better, because time is of the essence. When reporting to the local police and in another law enforcement agency, it's important to share as much detail as possible about your loved one when they go missing. Also, asking for an alert. A lot of times, people don't know that there's, they can ask for an alert in the crime alert, in specifically for adults. The Amber Alert is out there, but that's for children under the age of 17. And there's 3 criteria in order for an Amber Alert to be issued. And the three things that they look for as far as Amber Alert is they have to be under 17. Is the victim in danger of serious bodily harm or death? Is there information available that the public could use to help find the child and or the suspect? They're very strict about those 3 criteria in order to issue the Amber Alert, and those are issued through the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And then always ask for a police report and case number. And what in the cases that I've been involved with, cell phone information is very important, and then also social media websites. What sites are your loved ones? Do they belong to? Because those can be tracked to help find a missing person, and it has been very helpful in finding a few people in the cases that I've been involved with. Keep notes and follow up. All this information, I plan on having a website that people, hopefully one click, then they'll get all this information. Right now, it takes several clicks on different websites to get this information and even to get more information. Case review. The MMIR office is responsible for case review in conducting case reviews and report on the results of case reviews for the following types of missing and murdered Indigenous relative cases. Cold cases for missing Indigenous people, and death investigation review for cases of Indigenous people ruled as suicide or overdose under suspicious circumstances. I've been involved with 3 cases so far where I've assisted the tribal nations with 3 cases, and then gotten the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension involved with assisting with the review. The office is also responsible for the cross-jurisdiction cooperation, data sharing, and tracking. The MMIR office is responsible for developing a process to address the gaps in cross-jurisdiction cooperation, data sharing, and tracking. This issue will be addressed through recommendations from a research project mentioned previously. Right now, it's me being the go-between between law enforcement and families or different jurisdictions, and that goes into communicating with survivors and victims' families. They call the office, and the most common theme is that law enforcement response and follow-up is inadequate. I follow up with the law enforcement and involve the BCA to assist. I also try to connect families with tribal resources and victim service resources. Victim advocates are instrumental with assisting families in dealing with the trauma of a missing loved one. That's all I have. Now I'd like to turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you. So when we're thinking about this pandemic, this historical harm that is happening not only in Minnesota, but across Turtle Island to Indigenous peoples, it's important to think about, I always land like, how are we going to get ahead of it? And because of the work that I do in prisons, I've learned a lot over the last 15 years in working with our incarcerated Indigenous women, is that harm often occurs in our community when there's vulnerability. Harm occurs in our community when there is lack of value of the human being. So part of what we know historically is Indigenous women and girls, there has not been value of our lives by dominant society, which increases the risk factors and the vulnerabilities that we face every day, wherever we go. Wherever we go, any Indigenous, Native woman, any woman of color, you are a walking target for predators, for harm, based on not only race, but systematic racism as well. So in the work that myself and a team of other Indigenous women have been doing for very long, we notice in terms of how do we get to intervention and prevention, and it's getting to the root of the harm, the root, whether the harm was within family, within community, outside of community, and being able to employ resources. Indian country is one of the most under-resourced communities, nations in the country. So when there is victimization, whether it's physical, sexual, emotional, in our own communities, I would say in the 11 tribes, and Senator, please correct me if I'm wrong here, anybody correct me. You can go into any Indian health service, and if you're looking for a trauma specialist, you probably will not find that. You will not find a full-time mental health worker or a psychologist. Then where it gets really scary, because we know that the harm against our women, the victimization against our women, it's getting younger and younger for our children. There is a major lack of juvenile therapists, psychologists, trauma specialists that specialize in working with children and youth. So part of what we need to look at in terms of how are we going to get ahead of this issue, those who are most vulnerable, is we have to look at the lack of resources that Indian country receives from the states and the feds and from nonprofit agencies. We're one of the most underfunded populations in terms of trying to move ahead of this issue. So part of the work that we do is we try to work with community organizations and the state to say, start now. The way to start and help our women to heal and be stronger when they walk out of a facility is to make sure that they're having those resources, that they have access to healing-informed care, trauma-informed care, and that people from their community are in that prison and being able to work with them pre and post-release. I used to think, I'm really fortunate that I get to work with Tui, Bonnie, Claremont. And when we were doing our data collection, and before we hired an evaluator to go through all of our data, and I thought we were going to land at maybe 69%, 73% of incarcerated women were victims of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. And what we found out is it's 98% of our women have been victimized in some way, shape, or form. Next slide, please, that are incarcerated. And Nicole is the researcher, and she can probably do some very quick, like if we have 90%, 98% of incarcerated women that have been victimized, we wonder what that looks like in our urban and on our reservations as well. It's a very high number. So part of what the work, not only of my organization, but many within the state, is saying, how do we get ahead of this? And that means collaboration. That means talking about it. It means like, how are we going to get to what it is? And that is resources. And I think you could go into any state facility right now. They've been shut down Today is a remarkable day for the American Indian Prison Project. First day we were allowed back into the women's prison to work with our women there. But it's not only our communities that are under-resourced. If you look at the staffing and resources for mental health, trauma-informed care in any of the state facilities, it's lacking. They don't have the capacity to respond to our Indigenous people that have been traumatized, victimized. And then this is a place most people do not want to go. When our relatives enter prisons that have been victims, from day one, that re-victimization begins again. I would say for at least 75% of those women, in terms of the environment that they're existing in, that they move through, exposure in terms of racism, threats, all of that impacts the mental and physical well-being. So part of what the seed, if I could plant any seed for you, I really do believe that we can change this, and we change it by looking at the systems. So right now there's a lot of money that goes into big agencies in terms of where Indigenous men and women who have been victims, youth who have been victims, where they will be placed when they walk out of that prison. I invite anybody with me to work with me one day and follow, be with me when we're transporting one of our relatives from a prison in terms of their county or state placement. That is not where our people should be. There are already predators on the look, waiting on the corners, down the street, in the neighborhood, waiting and looking for vulnerable women. That's why the work that we do inside, the work that we do post-release to help our women and men and our youth to become stronger, and working with law enforcement, working with these agencies and programs that run these reentry programs is critical, because they've been traumatized pre-prison, they're traumatized again in prison, and then when they get placed in re-entry facilities, they are at higher risk because everybody knows where the women are being housed that came out of prison. I want to say pre-COVID, maybe 25% of the women I work with had already gone back to street life because that perpetrator was waiting for them. They know where they're going to be housed. So part of the work that we do is really focusing on healing and restoring, and not just working with our Indigenous women, but working with the case managers, working with program staff, helping them to understand that there's a different way to approach pre-release planning and case management of our relatives when they leave the institution. And it's strength-based, it's not deficit-based. Agencies that work with our women, they see them as a deficit, they see their weaknesses, and they don't see their strength. So there's a restorative model at how we come at this in terms of making sure that our women are leaving prison and going into safe environment, and that they have the resources and support that they need not to become a victim ever again. Next slide. So oftentimes when I'm asked to talk about restorative processes, everybody kind of falls into, oh, it must be circles. But it's really about systemic change in terms of how service providers, systems are working with our people, and that's changing that mindset. So we work with agencies, community programs, in terms of helping them to rethink of how they're providing services to our women, men, and youth coming out of prisons. And that involves building their capacity to have restorative conversations, being able to offer restorative circles, being able to bring in family to build a care plan that increases their success, decreases the risk of them being victimized again. So we believe that in our community, or I was mentored into this work, this service work, to know that We have more strengths than we have challenges. And it's how are we working with our strengths? How are we working with our resources to get ahead of this? Next slide. So what can you do? There is probably 1,001 things you can do. And the most important thing, as Senator shared, is education. Know that this isn't unique just to Indigenous people. It could be your child. It could be your sister. It could be you. Educate yourself and know what it looks like. It doesn't look, in terms of some of the propaganda and misinformation about sex trafficking that's out there. It is normalized in places that you wouldn't even imagine that it's normalized, in airports, in reservations, in restaurants. It is normalized in malls. It's like you are surrounded by perpetrators and people who would seek to cause harm and move people into human trafficking and sex trafficking. Advocacy, I grew up being a community organizer. It's not only advocating, but once you inform yourself, become involved. Everyone has something to contribute. Everyone that is on this session has a resource, has something they can contribute, because your community is being impacted just like our community. One of the things that really stood out for me during the work of the task force was we seldom talked about some of the intersection of victimizations and how building capacity of hospital staff could really play a pivotal role in terms of intervention and prevention. And most importantly, at schools. Young people learn from adults. So education for our youngest members of our population in terms of being able to prevent this epidemic. Next slide. And of course, making sure you know who you're voting for and where they stand in terms of these issues, resources to these issues, and making sure that your family, your extended family, is really aware of their own vulnerability and creating places and spaces in terms of to be able to talk about victimization and the potential of being a victim. And you can get on your after this, if you just Google, we have many agencies that work in our community in terms of domestic violence, our relatives that don't have shelter. So one of the ways you can contribute is by giving, by paying it forward. But I think the most important thing you could do is what I do every day I wake up around our incarcerated relatives. I always make a prayer that in 20 years that we're going to wake up and we're not going to have relatives in prison. When I started working for the task force and became aware of the prevalence and the impact, I make a prayer that someday this word will no longer be in our language. We will have eradicated this from our communities, from our nations. We will have protected our people from those that seek to do us harm. Next slide. I think this goes now to someone else.
I think we can open it up to the group to see if there's any questions or comments for any of the presenters. I saw there was a question at the beginning from Shannon in the chat about the potential for the dismantling of ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act. If we anticipate an increase in the removal of Native children from their homes and a subsequent increase in child trafficking. I'm not really sure if I can speak to that directly, but I know that a lot of, the reason for ICWA was because our children were being taken from us and not being put in safer places. They were being put in worse places than what they were being taken from a lot of times. And so I think that that's the reason for the law, was to protect the children and to keep them in the culture. But I'm not sure that I can speak directly about that. I don't know if Senator Kunesh, or if you want to say something about that.
Sure. So we definitely are very, very concerned about the federal government rolling back and dismantling the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act. In Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act. We call it MIFPA. And it is similar to ICWA in that it really lays out the process of addressing any kind of child removal or foster care or adoption outside of the family, Native family or tribes. I have been working this summer on going through the MIFPA statute and shoring it up, looking for any areas that we need to sort of enforce or bolster. And there's been a number of groups across the nation actually that are doing this work, and we're hoping to put together very shortly a piece of legislation for Minnesota that does that family preservation. And then that would become much like this Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force and Office, a prototype for other states to adopt as well. So we certainly are addressing that.
Thanks, Senator. Wondering if anybody else has any other questions. I see we just got something in the chat. Oh, like if someone, so the chat says you'd mentioned we need to be aware of and know what sex trafficking looks like, and wondering if someone believes they see a situation where this might be happening, if there's a code language that's been established to ask someone if they're safe. There are some common phrases for victims of domestic abuse. She wants to know that her part in the intervention is wanting to be aware that her part might not be welcomed by the women who are being abused. Yeah, I think that that's from my part, I'll just answer that, and then maybe Stephanie or others want to say something too. I do think that that's a situation where we have to be really, really careful about how we talk to women, because people who are being trafficked are at extreme danger of their safety, because the person who's trafficking them will often be using things like drugs or, other ways to maintain control, as well as financial abuse, making threats of violence to that person or their children or other family members. And so oftentimes the person who's being trafficked is terrified of that individual, as well as oftentimes thinks to that individual as their boyfriend. And so it's sort of like a really hard situation to know how to navigate. And then the last thing that I'll say is I'm working on a project in Minneapolis right now where there's 4 organizations that do outreach and support for people who are experiencing human trafficking. And the group, the collaborative group is called Upside, and they have like a phone number. This is just for Minneapolis, but they have a phone number that you can call. So like if you think that there's someone that's being trafficked in the restaurant that you're in, or someone who lives in the building next to you or in front of your place of work or something, you can call this number, and like experienced outreach workers can go out and check it out and see if there's a need for that. So I'll see if I can find that phone number really quick while others are asking questions, and I'll put that in the chat. But maybe some of my co-presenters also want to say something about that.
I guess I would just say is perhaps build an awareness, and if you do suspect that somebody is being trafficked or is a victim of violence, if you can very subtly, carefully let them know that you are a resource for them, or that you are willing to help in some way, but not to put them in any pressure. But also, there are resources like the American Indian Women's Resource Center and these other places that you might want to familiarize yourself with, or be able to, suggest that others use those resources. And it's not just, most of those resources are like family and children resource centers. So, when the weather changes, boots and hats and mittens for families, food, sometimes There's opportunities for medical attention. So it's more of a wraparound sort of service than just go in there because of violence. And it's a good way to sort of, you know, allow somebody to go in and talk to somebody without seemingly, you know, going against their, whoever it is that's perpetrating that violence on them. And then, you know, just educate yourself as well. I don't know if any of you have been reading or watching the show Alaska Daily. It's I think it's on ABC. You can stream the ones. It's specifically around this issue up in Anchorage, Alaska. And much of the things that we have been talking about here today are addressed in that, and it's addressed in a really good way.
Couple resources that we're putting in the chat here. I put in the Upside outreach phone number. That's, again, if you're in Minneapolis and you think that you're seeing an adult that's experiencing exploitation or sex trafficking, you can call them and they'll send someone to help. And Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center is a partner. Senator Kunesh mentioned that organization, which they do definitely a lot of work with this population in Minneapolis. And then Juliet put in yourcallmn.org, which is the site that we showed earlier that has information about sex trafficking if you want to see more information there. Welcome any other questions in the chat or speak up if you want to say them aloud. So we got a question in the chat. This problem is multi-tribal, local, national, and international. What steps are being taken to enhance multi-agency cooperation, including state, tribal, state, federal agencies like the FBI and the BIA? And I can say from just my small little part or role in this, that one of the things that I'm excited about is that I'm going to be working with the MMIR office in Minnesota, as well as the MMIW task force in Utah, and working on similar efforts to identify some best practices in investigation of MMIW cases. And so when possible, you know, just at least on the research side that I'm working on, I'm trying to coordinate. I've also connected with the folks that are doing the MMIW task force in Wisconsin and someone who's doing some research in California. So just informally, I think we're trying to connect and like make sure that we're reading each other's reports and building off of other things rather than recreating the wheel. There's also going to be an expert consultant who's joining us on this project with the MMIR office, who is former FBI. And so he brings that knowledge of the federal practices and also has connections with the Operation Lady Justice, which is the federal effort, MMIW effort. So I hope there's some ways, at least informally, and like I said, in my small little part of it, where we're trying to make some of those connections. But it is a huge multi-pronged issue with lots of different agencies and stuff involved across all states, right? So. Juliet, did you want to say anything else about that or any other thoughts?
Well, I was looking for the question and it's not in my chat area. Just wanted to mention I work with the FBI, the BIA, and a lot of different jurisdictions. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension is a state agency, and so they've been really helpful with me in developing relationships with jurisdictions where there's a missing person. And then in the near future, we'll be having a meeting with all the tribal nations and their law enforcement. And then we'll invite, I work with the BIA Operation Lady Justice representative, Michael Potter. We'll be meeting and talking about different strategies and what's new out there. So we do law enforcement, you know, traditionally, they have issues with communicating with each other, and that even came out in the task force report, I think. And so I'm trying to establish those relationships, and and with the work that's going to get done with the additional research and establishing a protocol, MMIR protocol, that I believe is going to be rolled out to the tribal nations and to the state law enforcement, to include local, state, and federal agencies. So, I mean, we'll get there, and working with each other can always be better. And just by meeting and establishing those relationships is important.
Yeah. And I was going to share one of the things that I always think envisioning what can change is important for those that are working in communities. And for, there are states that have higher incidences of sex trafficking, human trafficking, murdering of our women, youth, and men around this. And what I see as a gap, and I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to it, is it's usually coming from a tribal community, a nation itself, like I'll take Pine Ridge, that is left to utilize their own resources from the community and compile the list of missing and murdered women. It's not coming from a state agency or a federal agency in terms of what is going on in that state with the number of missing and murdered Indigenous people. So I always think that if there was more cooperation in terms of information that was being disseminated and it not falling, in the burden of the community to get the word out about how many missing and murdered relatives we have, that there might influence decision makers to apply more resources in terms of law enforcement, people to be working on the ground in our communities.
Appreciate that, Stephanie. Thank you for sharing that, and Juliet. And I know we're a little bit over time here, so I'm from my part, I'll just say Chimigwech, which is a big thank you to everybody for coming to our session, and for also to my co-presenters. I always appreciate having an opportunity to present with these intelligent and actively working ladies who are actively working on this issue every day, right? So it's good to be with you all here. Thanks for your time, and hope you all have an excellent rest of your day.